My family called me a waitress at the gala, but when my husband arrived, they didn't recognize me at first. I was just another woman in a sleek black dress, standing quietly near the back of the ballroom, sipping champagne like I belonged there. But I didn't belong, not to them, not anymore. I was the forgotten daughter, the shadow in family photos, the name they barely said out loud, unless it came with a sigh or a roll of the eyes. When the servers began to pass hors d'oeuvres, my stepmother Victoria raised her glass and announced with a smirk that I looked ready to get back to work. A few chuckles floated through the crowd, followed by the words that landed like glass across my chest. "She's just a waitress, you know." The room didn't laugh, they stared. I felt the heat of their judgment, the ripple of discomfort, the way people do when cruelty is too personal to enjoy out loud. They didn't know that the man funding this entire gala, the anonymous name behind the foundation banner, was walking through the doors right now. My husband. But before I tell you what happened in that ballroom, you need to understand how I ended up there at all. My name is Meredith Hayden. I'm 29. I live in New York now, but I grew up in Chicago, where the Hayden family name still carries weight in publishing circles. My father, Charles Hayden, founded Hayden Publishing Group before I was born. He built it from the ground up, started with serialized literary journals, and turned it into a boutique house known for elevating new voices. My mother, Elise, was the soul of that world. A painter and poet who taught me to find the details no one else saw. She passed away when I was 7, and for a while after that, it was just me and my dad. We had soup dinners in the office break room, and he'd read my short stories like they were prize-winning novels. He never treated me like a child, only like someone he hoped would someday take the helm beside him. Then Victoria arrived. She was everything my mother wasn't. Polished, calculating, almost too composed. She ran a fine art consultancy in Manhattan and had a daughter from a previous marriage named Savannah. Savannah and I were the same age, but we couldn't have been more different. Where I wore hand-me-downs and spent weekends editing school zines, Savannah lived in designer labels and perfected her ballet poses for Instagram. Victoria and Savannah moved into our lives like they'd always belonged. At first, I tried to adapt. I even called Victoria V like Savannah did, hoping that if I folded myself small enough, there would be space for me too. But I quickly learned that my presence was a problem they were eager to outgrow. After the wedding, Victoria began reshaping everything, including my father. Our dinners shrank from 3 seats to 2. My opinions were met with careful silence. By high school, I was spending more time in libraries and part-time jobs than at home. I knew where the new family portrait hung, the one without me in it. When I brought it up once, my father gave me that tired, distracted look and said something vague about blending. That word stuck with me for years. Blending. Like I was a pigment to be diluted until invisible. When he died unexpectedly during my senior year of college, I was overseas on an academic fellowship. I found out from an email forwarded by a professor. I wasn't included in the funeral planning. I wasn't even mentioned in the obituary. When the estate was settled, I was given a small sum in acknowledgement of family legacy, while Victoria and Savannah absorbed the company, the home, the reputation. I didn't fight it. I didn't have the strength or the money. I walked away with a diploma, a resume, and a suitcase. That was 10 years ago. In that decade, I built a quiet life. I started at a small press in Brooklyn, worked my way up, launched several successful debut novels, and eventually joined a nonprofit that supports creative education for girls in underserved neighborhoods. It didn't pay much, but it mattered. That's where I met Graham, the program's largest donor. He wasn't flashy. He wore sweaters with holes in the cuffs and made terrible coffee. But he listened when I spoke. He remembered the name of my favorite poet and showed up to student exhibitions with flowers for the kids, not for the cameras. I didn't tell him about my family at first. I wanted someone to love me for who I was now, not who I used to be. When we got married 2 years ago, it was small and quiet, held in his mother's garden with no press, no photos, no Savannah. I hadn't heard from Victoria in nearly 5 years when the invitation arrived. It was hand-embossed, ivory, and cold. A formal gala, in honor of Hayden Publishing's new literacy initiative, hosted by the Victoria Hayden Foundation, with a handwritten note inside. "It's time we reconnect. The family would love to see you." I stared at it for a long time before I told Graham. I didn't know that the gala she was throwing was being secretly funded by his foundation. He didn't know the Hayden name was mine. That's how cleanly they'd removed me from the narrative, and yet somehow, she had found out about me. The night of the gala, I walked in alone by design. Graham would come later. We had a plan, but part of me still doubted I had the courage to follow through. Then Victoria saw me turn to the crowd and smirked. She's just a waitress. The thing about growing up in a family that subtly but relentlessly rejects you is that you learn to read between lines. You learn to recognize performance in every gesture manipulation, in every smile. So when Victoria's invitation arrived with that overly polite handwriting and carefully selected words, I didn't mistake it for sincerity. It wasn't warmth. It was strategy. But even then, I couldn't have predicted the real motive behind it, nor the cruelty she had choreographed for the night of the gala. The irony, of course, was that the only reason I considered going was because of Graham. When I showed him the invitation, I expected him to suggest tossing it. Instead, he read it twice, then slowly said, "You should go. Not because of her, but because of you." I wasn't convinced. We had built a life that had nothing to do with the Haydens. No name, no network, no obligations. I had never even told people at work that I was related to the infamous Victoria Hayden. Most assumed it was coincidence. But Graham was calm as always, and thoughtful in a way that made me trust him even when I wanted to retreat. We didn't know yet that the Victoria Hayden Foundation had been selected to receive a major matching grant through the Ellis Fund, which was managed by the board Graham chaired. He only discovered the overlap a week later during a quarterly report. By then, the RSVP deadline had passed, and my name was already on the list. She probably saw it somewhere, Graham said when I asked if he thought Victoria had done this intentionally. A news clipping, a mention, a tag. I kept my last name privately at work, but not everywhere else. We weren't public, but we weren't invisible. There was a moment when I almost backed out. The morning of the event, I sat on our kitchen floor staring at my shoes like they were the problem. Graham sat beside me silently until I broke the quiet. "What if she does something?" I asked. "She will," he replied without hesitation, "but so will you." He waited a beat, then added, "You don't owe anyone grace tonight. You only owe yourself truth." That line stayed with me as I dress-slipped on the deep emerald gown I'd chosen and stepped into the car that would take me to the venue alone. The Rosebourne Gallery was an iconic place, the kind of building featured in luxury travel blogs and old money wedding spreads. It used to be a textile warehouse before being transformed into an event space, all exposed beams and curated art installations. When I arrived, the valet opened the door as if I were someone important. For the first few moments, I allowed myself to feel the tension melt into quiet confidence. I gave my name, collected my badge, and walked in like any other guest. Inside, the crowd was already in full swing. Crystal glasses clinked, jazz music threaded through the air, and photographers hovered just out of frame. I moved, deliberately pausing at a few installations, watching people more than art. It didn't take long for the stares to begin. People remembered me, but not with clarity, just with discomfort. Like the face of someone you once disliked but can't quite recall why. That was the Hayden way. Rewrite history until your conscience became comfortable. Victoria made her entrance soon after. She was in red, of course. Always in red at these events. Her hair styled in its signature sleek chignon makeup, flawless smile polished but vacant. Savannah was beside her, draped in sequins, her phone glued to one hand, already whispering into a friend's ear while nodding in my direction. I didn't move. I held my glass and kept my back straight. I wasn't there to play their game, only to survive the night. When Victoria finally acknowledged me, it was with a theatrical gasp, as if I'd risen from the dead. "Meredith," she said loudly, drawing nearby attention. What a surprise. Her eyes scanned me top to bottom, pausing at the badge on my wrist. "Did someone let you in early to help with service?" I smiled politely, refusing to take the bait. "I was invited." "Of course," she said, quickly as if catching herself. "We did want to include everyone." The pause before that word wasn't subtle. The air around us began to shift. People watched the interaction, the way they watch an oncoming storm, uncertain if it would pass or destroy. Savannah leaned in, then voice sugary but sharp. "The color's daring," she said, gesturing to my gown. "Was it from last season's community feature?" Someone laughed. Someone else didn't. I didn't respond. But the comment that truly landed, the one that reset the entire room, came a few moments later. Victoria turned to a cluster of donors and said lightly, "We're lucky Meredith's here tonight." With her experience in service, she knows how to keep things running smoothly. There was a beat of awkward silence. Someone coughed. Someone chuckled. Then a whisper started moving. Is she serious? Wasn't Meredith a publisher once? Did she really just call her staff? That was when I realized what this was. It wasn't an invitation, it was a setup. I wasn't there to be welcomed back. I was there to be diminished publicly, to be made small in front of the donors, the politicians, the press. I saw Julian, her PR manager, hovering nearby with a barely concealed smirk. This had been planned. She wanted people to know that I was nothing, that I had no place in the family, and that even with the Hayden name, I was the footnote, the forgotten, the girl who cleared dishes while they collected applause. I almost walked out then. Almost texted Graham and told him not to come. That it wasn't worth it. But as I reached for my phone, I saw him enter the ballroom, calm and unbothered, dressed like someone who had nothing to prove but everything to protect. And that was when the night truly began. Graham walked in like someone who didn't need the room's approval to own it. He had that quiet authority, the kind that comes not from wealth alone but from certainty. His tuxedo was tailored, but understated, his expression unreadable, except for the flicker in his eyes when they found me. He walked straight toward me without glancing at the curated crowd or the people who had just finished laughing at my expense. I saw the realization cross Victoria's face before he even reached me. For the first time in my life, she looked unsure. Graham leaned in, gently brushing his hand against mine, and asked if I was all right. I nodded, though we both knew the answer. Then he turned to the nearest staff member and quietly asked for a glass of water for me, the kind of small but intimate gesture that didn't need translation. Victoria stepped forward quickly, that hostess smile returning like a reflex. "Mr. Ellis," she began, offering her hand. "What a lovely surprise. I didn't know you two had met." Graham didn't take her hand. "We're married," he said calmly. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "I believe you sent my wife a handwritten invitation." There was a beat of stunned silence. Savannah dropped her phone to her side. Julian looked like he had just swallowed a lemon. I stood still, letting the words hang in the air. Victoria's smile faltered, but didn't fall. "Of course, we're thrilled she could attend. What an unexpected delight." But her voice betrayed her. It had lost its power. The people around us had heard her earlier remarks. They knew she hadn't invited me as a guest of honor but as a target. And now that target had a name, a husband, and apparently a lot more influence than they had anticipated. The ripples started subtly. People whispering behind glasses, heads turning glances, darting between me and Graham. Someone murmured the word Ellis like it was suddenly heavy with consequence. Graham didn't raise his voice or escalate. He just stood beside me, his presence unraveling the narrative Victoria had tried to create. "I had no idea this event was connected to your foundation," she added quickly, trying to recover. "We're so grateful for the support. The hospital initiative is very dear to us." He looked at her for a long second before answering. "That's the only reason we agreed to back it. For the children, not the name on the program." That was the first crack. The first real sign that the power she had carefully curated for years wasn't indestructible. Savannah stepped in, then trying to soften the moment with a brittle smile. "Wow, Meredith, you really kept this quiet. We're so happy for you." She moved to hug me, and Graham subtly stepped between us without saying a word. "You were filming her earlier," he said, his tone still mild but unmistakably serious. "Don't pretend this is a reunion." I watched her shrink a little, pulling her phone closer to her body. She didn't deny it. She couldn't. Too many people had seen. Victoria tried again this time, reaching for charm. "This must all be a misunderstanding. We've missed Meredith so much. I've always considered her family." Graham raised an eyebrow, the only visible sign of skepticism. "Interesting. She told me she received no contact from you in 5 years. No calls, no visits, not even a card when we got married." The way he said it wasn't accusatory. It was factual, which made it worse. The surrounding crowd began shifting. The photographers now turned toward us, sensing a real story unfolding. A few of the board members from the children's hospital edged closer, pretending to be engrossed in conversation but clearly listening. Graham didn't intend to embarrass them, but truth has its own gravity. You can't fake inclusion when exclusion has been so well documented. Victoria pivoted toward the broader crowd. Let's not turn this into something it isn't. We're all here for a good cause. She tried to move the conversation away, pointing to the silent auction and complimenting the artist's selection. But it was too late. Her control over the room had fractured. Someone from the press quietly asked the event coordinator to confirm the donor identity. Another whispered to Julian, who suddenly looked very busy on his phone. I stood quietly through all of this, feeling something I hadn't felt in years: agency. Not revenge, not triumph, just presence. For the first time, I wasn't being erased. I wasn't being talked over, corrected, or reframed. I was being seen, not because I shouted, but because the silence had shifted in my favor. As the dinner bell rang and guests were directed toward the main tables, I heard someone say I thought she was just staff. Someone else corrected them. She's Ellis's wife, the Meredith Hayden. From Hayden Publishing. That second name still startled me. It didn't feel like mine anymore. But tonight, for once, I let it rest in the air. Not to reclaim it, but to acknowledge what it had cost. Graham and I walked together to the head table, which now had two newly printed name cards in front of the center seats. Someone had scrambled to make that happen. Victoria's table was no longer the focal point. Julian stood off to the side, watching everything with a tight jaw. Savannah sat down with exaggerated grace, pretending nothing had happened, but her eyes kept darting toward us. And Victoria, for all her efforts, could no longer hide the panic in the corners of her mouth. We hadn't made a scene. We hadn't said anything cruel. But sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is show up and let people reveal themselves. As dinner began, the tension in the room didn't settle. It shimmered quietly beneath the surface, the way it does when the script everyone rehearsed no longer applies. Graham sat beside me, calm and steady, occasionally leaning over to translate names or whisper small observations. He wasn't fazed, and that steadiness grounded me in ways I hadn't expected. Across the ballroom, Victoria raised her glass to begin a toast. She welcomed everyone with her signature charm, full of practiced warmth and elegant deflection. We are here tonight not just to celebrate progress, but to uplift the next generation, she said, her voice effortlessly gliding over the mess that had unfolded earlier. She never mentioned me by name, never acknowledged the incident, but her eyes flicked toward our table more than once, and each time I met her gaze without flinching. The speeches continued, filled with buzzwords about literacy, empowerment, and community. I wondered how many of the people here actually believed the words they clapped for, and how many were simply waiting for the dessert course and the chance to be photographed beside the right name. I had lived long enough in proximity to wealth to know the difference. When the final speaker stepped down and the music resumed, guests began circulating again, this time with a different energy. A few familiar faces approached our table, most with awkward smiles and suddenly renewed interest in my work. One man introduced himself as a longtime admirer of my publishing years and said he had no idea I was still involved in the field. I didn't correct him. I simply nodded and thanked him for remembering. People don't often remember unless they need to. Savannah approached not long after, her expression somewhere between forced sweetness and mild panic. "You look great tonight, Meredith," she said too loudly, as if trying to erase the memory of her earlier mockery with sheer volume. "That dress really brings out your eyes." I thanked her, my voice even not giving her anything to latch onto. She shifted uncomfortably, then added, "We should catch up sometime. Maybe do lunch." I smiled politely. "I'll check my calendar." She nodded quickly, then turned to speak with someone else before her confidence cracked further. What struck me most wasn't the shift in how people treated me, but how predictable it was. The moment they realized I wasn't just the discarded daughter, the narrative changed. I hadn't done anything different. I hadn't changed my name, my face, my work. The only thing that shifted was visibility. And when visibility came with perceived power, their tone followed. That realization didn't sting the way it used to. It simply clarified everything I already knew. This had never been about merit. It had always been about control. Julian, the PR manager who had helped orchestrate my earlier humiliation, avoided me for most of the night, but eventually he appeared, offering a thin smile and some comment about misunderstanding. He mentioned optics, tone, and phrasing, all the professional language people use to avoid accountability. Graham didn't speak, but his presence beside me was enough to cut through the act. Julian ended the conversation quickly and walked away, his steps just a little too fast to be casual. Toward the end of the night, I excused myself to step outside for air. The terrace was quieter, string lights glowing softly along the railing and a cool breeze brushing against my skin. I stood there for a moment, staring at the skyline, letting the noise of the event fade behind me. It wasn't sadness I felt or anger. It was something closer to detachment. I no longer needed these people to see me or understand me. I had spent years shrinking myself to earn proximity to a family that had decided long ago I was disposable. Now that I stood as someone they couldn't ignore, it didn't feel victorious. It just felt final. Graham joined me a few minutes later, holding 2 glasses of sparkling water. "You did well," he said quietly. "You didn't let them shape you tonight." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I asked him what he saw when he looked at this world. "Rooms like this," I said, gesturing behind us. "Does it feel familiar to you?" He thought for a second. "Not really," he replied. "It feels like wallpaper to me. Temporary, replaceable, pretty when you're not paying attention." That made me smile, not because it was poetic, but because it was true. That ballroom, those titles, even that foundation, they were wallpaper pasted over deeper cracks, meant to distract rather than repair. As we returned inside for the closing ceremony, Victoria took the stage once more. She thanked everyone for their generosity and began listing major sponsors. She still hadn't acknowledged Graham or his foundation by name, likely because she was trying to preserve the illusion that the event stood on her merit alone. But the program had already been circulated. Attendees already knew. One of the board members leaned over to whisper to another, and both turned to look at our table. When the applause began, it was louder than before, but not for her. In the final moments of the night, one of the hospital directors stepped up to make a surprise announcement. He thanked the anonymous benefactor who had matched every dollar raised that evening, and though he didn't say it outright, every person in that room turned to face Graham. His name didn't need to be said. The shift was complete. What began as an ambush had become an unraveling, and the people who tried to erase me now had to applaud the man who had always seen me. By the time the final applause faded, the mood in the room had changed completely. Victoria stepped off the stage with her usual grace, but this time her movements were sharper, clipped at the edges. The smile stayed, but it clung to her face like a cracked mask. People no longer surrounded her with the same eagerness. A few nodded politely. Others glanced toward her and turned away. The center of gravity had shifted, and she felt it. I could see it in how she walked slightly faster, slightly more aware of the eyes she used to control. Graham remained seated beside me, finishing the last sip of sparkling water, calm as ever. He didn't need the crowd's attention, and that only made them more interested. We stood slowly, as the event began to wind down the room, thinning out with the subtle panic of social hierarchy rearranging itself. Several guests approached us with a different energy than before, as if trying to rewrite their earlier reactions mid-conversation. One woman leaned in and complimented my grace under pressure, using the word dignified like it was a confession. Another man told Graham that his anonymous generosity was the kind of leadership this city needed more of, conveniently ignoring that he'd earlier laughed at Victoria's waitress remark. I smiled, nodded, thanked them. But inside, I felt none of it land. The applause, the compliments, the sudden revisionist admiration, it all felt like noise. Savannah didn't come near us again. She stayed across the room with a group of younger influencers, laughing too loudly, her energy strangely erratic. From the corner of my eye, I caught her scrolling through old posts on her phone as if hunting for the version of herself that still had power. Julian disappeared altogether, likely slipping out before the press could corner him. Victoria, however, wasn't done. As we made our way toward the exit, she stepped into our path with a glass of champagne in her hand and the polished veneer of a woman clinging to control. "Meredith," she said, her voice bright but brittle, "could I have a moment with you alone?" Graham looked at me, waiting for a cue. I gave him a small nod and he stepped aside just enough to give us space without leaving. Victoria lowered her voice. "You've made your point tonight. Very effectively, I might add." I didn't respond. She continued. "This event was meant to highlight something meaningful, something bigger than family grievances. I hope you understand that. Her tone was coated with civility, but the message was clear she was trying to pull the spotlight back. I met her gaze and answered simply, "You're right. It was meant to be about something meaningful. And it still is. That's exactly why I came." She blinked, unsure of how to respond. Then, for the first time in years, she dropped the act for a split second. Her expression cracked just enough to show the resentment underneath. "You've always had a flair for dramatics," she muttered. "That's what your father feared too." That sentence landed like a slap, but it didn't hurt the way she wanted it to. Because I knew now that my father had feared many things: being alone, being manipulated, making the wrong choices. But he had never feared me. He feared losing me. And in the end, he had. "You don't get to rewrite him," I said quietly. "Not anymore." Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came. I stepped past her, joining Graham, who offered me his hand like it was second nature. As we walked out of the ballroom, I felt the weight of the room behind me. Not just the eyes or the whispers, but the decades of erasure trying to catch up with the present. But I didn't look back. That version of my life had already ended. All that remained was the echo. Outside, the city felt quieter than usual. Or maybe I had finally stopped listening for permission to exist. Graham squeezed my hand as our car pulled up to the curb. Before getting in, I glanced once at the building behind us. Not to gloat, not to wonder what they were thinking, but simply to acknowledge the full circle. I had walked into that event, expecting humiliation. Instead, I walked out with my voice intact, and my past put in its place. The ride home was silent at first. Then Graham turned to me and asked, "How do you feel?" I thought about it for a moment, then said lighter. "Not happier, just lighter." He nodded as if that made perfect sense. "You don't need their apology," he said, "because they've already shown you who they are." That line didn't need a response. It just sat there between us, true and complete. I looked out the window as the city blurred by not thinking about what they'd say tomorrow or who would pretend to forget what happened tonight. It didn't matter. I wasn't there to be accepted. I was there to let go. In the weeks that followed the gala, I didn't post anything. I didn't comment, clarify, or attempt to reframe what had happened. The silence spoke for itself. For once, I didn't feel the need to explain who I was or defend my right to exist in a space that was built on selective memory. People who needed to know already knew, and those who didn't never really mattered. Graham returned to Singapore for a series of meetings, and I stayed behind in New York to settle a few things I had left open too long. I rented a temporary studio in the West Village, somewhere quiet and bathed in natural light, and began sifting through old boxes of my early work. Not because I missed the past, but because I wanted to reclaim what still felt mine. One afternoon, while sorting through old manuscripts and marked up galleys, I came across a journal I kept during my first year editing. The handwriting was tight, precise, almost rigid. I had forgotten how hard I tried to control the narrative back then, even in private. One entry stood out. It read, "If they don't see me, I'll make myself invisible until I'm undeniable." I closed the book slowly, letting the weight of that sentence sit with me. That girl still lived inside me, but she no longer drove. She had needed to disappear to survive. But I no longer needed to survive. I was building now. I began quietly consulting again, working with smaller publishers and authors whose voices had been minimized or erased. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent years trying to be visible in a family that saw me as a placeholder, and now I was helping others hold space for themselves. One of the authors I mentored, a young woman from New Orleans, wrote a memoir that landed on a regional bestseller list within months. She sent me a handwritten note that simply said, "You helped me believe this mattered." I didn't need a byline. That note was enough. At some point, the story from the gala began to fade from the headlines, but the ripple effect didn't stop. Julian stepped down from his position at the foundation 6 weeks later, citing personal reasons. Several donors pulled out quietly, and the board issued a new charter that removed Victoria from the chairwoman role, assigning her instead as a ceremonial figurehead. On paper, it looked like nothing, but in legacy circles it was a clean demotion. No one addressed it directly. That's how power moves in those spaces, silently, without confession, but undeniably. I received an invitation in the mail one morning, elegant script on cream cardstock. It was for an upcoming charity event, hosted by one of the art museums downtown, and I had been listed as a featured patron. I declined, not because I held a grudge but because I had nothing to prove. My presence was no longer a plea for recognition. I spent more time walking alone by the river watching the seasons turn. Some days I met with friends who had stayed quietly loyal, the kind who never needed to be impressed to be present. Other days I simply wrote, not for publication but for clarity. I didn't want revenge. I wanted peace. Eventually Graham returned. We didn't speak much about the gala or the fallout. It wasn't avoidance. It was closure. He told me about a new health literacy initiative he was funding in Southeast Asia, and I offered to help with content development. We fell into an easy rhythm, one built on respect, not performance. One night, while we sat on the fire escape, watching the city dim beneath us, he asked me if I had any regrets. I thought about it for a long time before answering. Not anymore, I said. I think I needed to lose the version of me they approved of before I could find the one I actually like. That version of me didn't need applause to know her worth. She didn't need an invitation to know she belonged. And she certainly didn't need family to validate her story. Family, as I had learned, is not just blood. It is presence, it is protection, it is truth. I had spent so long trying to prove I was worthy of being chosen by the wrong people that I had missed the quiet loyalty of those who never needed convincing. Now I saw them clearly. And I saw myself too. The city hadn't changed. But I had. A few months after the gala, a journalist reached out through a mutual connection. She was working on a feature about legacy publishing and its quiet gatekeepers, particularly women who had shaped bestsellers but remained unnamed. I didn't plan to respond. At that point, I had made peace with my absence from the public narrative. But something about her message stayed with me. It wasn't pushy or transactional. It was simple. She wrote, "I think stories told in silence deserve space too." That line sat in my inbox for 2 weeks before I finally agreed to meet her for coffee. We met at a quiet spot in Tribeca, a bookstore cafe I used to frequent during my early editing days. The place hadn't changed much, still smelled of old paper and strong espresso. She was younger than I expected, maybe late 20s, and she listened more than she spoke. I appreciated that. We talked for over 2 hours. I didn't name names. I didn't drag anyone. I just told her what it felt like to be invisible while shaping stories that became household names. I told her about edits I'd made, that saved books, titles I'd named, authors I'd mentored quietly, while others took the public credit. I didn't need her to make me a martyr. I just needed her to see it clearly. When the article came out, it wasn't dramatic. It didn't go viral, but it reached the right people. Former colleagues messaged to say they hadn't known, or worse, they had known and felt complicit. One writer I had mentored years ago sent a voice note saying, "I wouldn't have a career if you hadn't fought for my work." She cried in the message. I didn't. Not because I wasn't moved, but because my tears had dried long ago. What I felt now wasn't grief. It was something closer to stillness. Not silence from erasure, but silence from understanding. I no longer needed to be loud to be whole. Victoria never responded to the article. I hadn't expected her to, but I did hear through a friend that she canceled 2 appearances and quietly removed her name from an upcoming book project. Whether that was guilt, image control, or self-preservation, I didn't know, and I didn't care. Her narrative wasn't mine to manage anymore. I had spent too many years ghostwriting other people's power. Now I was writing my own. Around that time, Graham and I attended a small event hosted by a nonprofit for underrepresented authors. There were no red carpets, no press walls, just folding chairs, good lighting, and raw stories that hadn't been sanded down for mass approval. I was introduced simply as Meredith Hayden's story consultant and editor. That was enough. A young poet stood up that night and shared a piece about reclaiming the parts of herself that had been edited out by people who said they loved her. She didn't know my history, but her words felt like they'd been carved from it. I clapped until my hands stung. After the event, one of the organizers asked if I'd consider joining the board in an advisory role. I said yes, not because I needed the title, but because it meant I could protect others from the kind of quiet dismissal I had lived through. In my past life, I would have overthought it, worried about appearances, legacy, impact. Now I just asked myself one question. Does this help me stay whole? If yes, I moved forward. If no, I let it go. One morning, I walked into the old Harper Row building, not for confrontation, but because a friend who still worked there had invited me to speak to a group of interns. It felt strange at first stepping back into a place where I had once been erased so efficiently. But the walls had changed. The leadership had shifted. And the interns didn't know my history, which was exactly what made it powerful. I wasn't there as a symbol of revenge, I was there as proof that clarity outlasts control. As I wrapped up my talk, one of them asked, "What's the hardest part about building something and not being seen?" I paused, not for effect, but because I wanted to answer with precision. The hardest part, I said, is not losing your voice while everyone else is speaking over you. But the most important part is this: you only need to hear yourself clearly. The rest follows. They wrote it down. I didn't correct them or soften it. That moment, like everything else now, was quiet but complete. About a year after the gala, I received a formal invitation to speak at a panel titled Women in Legacy Media. It was hosted by one of the city's more prestigious cultural institutions and co-sponsored by Harper Row, the same company that once erased me without hesitation. The irony wasn't lost on me. For a moment, I considered declining. Not out of spite, but because I had no desire to step back into a room curated by the very people who had once tried to overwrite my place in the industry. But something in me had changed. I wasn't doing this for them. I was doing it for the version of myself who had once walked home in the rain after being humiliated in a boardroom for the woman who sat in silence while others presented her work as theirs. So I said yes. I didn't announce it. I didn't promote the event or share it with old contacts. I wanted to arrive without noise, to sit in that chair and speak with the same quiet clarity that had carried me through every private injustice. The auditorium was full when I arrived. I recognized a few familiar faces: editors who had kept their heads down when I was pushed out, executives who once invited me to meetings but never gave me the floor. Some of them nodded when they saw me. I nodded back. I wasn't interested in pretending. I wasn't interested in revenge either. I just wanted to be honest. The moderator introduced each speaker with a brief summary of our careers. When it was my turn, she said, "Meredith Hayden, former senior editor and current founder of Hayden Inc. Collective, an incubator for underrepresented voices." The title was accurate. What she didn't say, what no one said, was that I had once been part of the very machinery that had long shut those voices out. That was the part I chose to tell. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't tell them how I'd been erased. I told them how easy it is to believe in systems that reward you for staying silent. I talked about the temptation to blend in, to become indispensable but invisible, and how that kind of loyalty is often the easiest to exploit. I said, there's a cost to being silent in spaces that are built on borrowed credit. And by the time you realize what they've taken, they've already trademarked your contribution. There was a stillness in the room. Not applause, just attention. The kind that used to elude me in rooms like this. One panelist, a younger editor who clearly respected the institution she worked for, asked, "How do you make peace with people who never apologized?" I thought for a second before replying. "You don't," I said. "You just learn not to wait for the apology to begin healing." After the panel, several people came up to speak with me. Some apologized quietly for past behavior. Others simply said thank you. One woman, a new hire at Harper Row, told me she had found my name in the footnotes of an old imprint file and looked me up. She said, "They may have tried to delete you, but your work left fingerprints." I smiled at that. Not out of pride, but recognition. You don't need to be on the cover to shape the story. That evening, as I walked out of the building, I passed by a glass wall where portraits of former senior staff hung. Victoria's photo was still there, sharp and polished, smiling as if untouched by the years of quiet sabotage she'd inflicted. I didn't stop walking. That photo didn't matter. What mattered was that I no longer wanted to be on that wall. I had stopped seeking approval from the halls that had once dismissed me. Now I wanted impact, not placement. Later that week, I was invited to contribute a guest lecture at a local MFA program. I told them I didn't want to talk about publishing politics. I wanted to talk about identity and how easy it is to lose your name in a room that's only built to echo certain voices. The room was small, the students alert. I told them, the goal isn't to be known. It's to be remembered for something that mattered. And sometimes that happens long after the applause has faded. One of the students, a young man with a quiet demeanor and a spiral-bound notebook filled with red ink annotations, asked, "How do you know when it's time to stop proving yourself?" I looked at him for a long moment and said, "When you finally realize that your worth isn't up for debate. Not anymore, not ever again." A few months later, I received a call from someone I hadn't spoken to in nearly a decade. Her name was Clara Mendel, a former junior editor I'd mentored back when I was still considered promising at Harper Row. She now led her own imprint focused on intersectional nonfiction. Her voice still carried that slightly nervous lilt, but there was a steadiness underneath it that I recognized. She told me she'd been following my work quietly for years, especially since I launched Hayden Inc. Collective, and she was curating a private roundtable for industry leaders who'd chosen alternative paths after being pushed out, overlooked, or forgotten. She asked if I'd be willing to speak not as someone with a resume, but as someone who'd rebuilt without needing the old rooms to open again. I said yes, without hesitation. Not because I needed the spotlight, not because I wanted to teach, but because I remembered what it felt like to be silenced in a space that once praised you for being useful, and then discarded you the moment your usefulness threatened their control. The event wasn't grand. It took place in a converted print shop, with exposed beams, and the faint smell of paper and ink still lingering in the walls. There were maybe 20 people, most of them women, a few men, a few non-binary creatives, all of them carrying stories of quiet severance from loud institutions. They weren't interested in glamour, they wanted clarity. And so did I. When it was my turn, I didn't bring notes. I didn't prepare a speech. I just spoke the way I would if we were sitting across from each other with coffee and no need to impress. I told them how it feels to be in a room where your silence is currency, and how betrayal in professional spaces isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it looks like someone else getting credit for the words you wrote. Sometimes it looks like a job offer vanishing the moment you stop saying yes. And sometimes it looks like your family clinking champagne glasses with the people who once erased your name. One woman, a former network executive, asked me if I ever confronted the people who wronged me. I told her the truth. I didn't, not directly. I never wrote the rage-fueled email. I never demanded they admit what they'd done. Not because I was afraid, but because I realized something important. You don't need to win in their arena to prove you were always playing the real game. Sometimes letting them keep the stage while you build your own theater is the most honest act of resistance. You don't get back at them. You get back to yourself. There was a stillness after I finished. Then Clara looked at me with a softness that caught me off guard and said, "What do you tell people who say you were too quiet for too long?" I paused, not because I didn't have an answer, but because I wanted to say it right. "I tell them silence is not the absence of strength," I said. "It's where I learned to sharpen mine." That night, after the session ended, a few of us lingered. The conversation turned from stories to ideas. What if we built a space not just to grieve what we'd lost, but to amplify what we'd become? Not a revenge platform, but a reimagining. Something that didn't require us to go back to the institutions we once tried so hard to impress. A place where we weren't defined by the titles they gave us or the roles they refused us. Just a space for what was honest, earned, and unpolished. It wasn't a business plan. Not yet. It was just the seed of something planted in a room no one could close on us anymore. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was anxious, but because for the first time in years I felt creatively alive again. Not nostalgic. Not bitter. Just awake to what could be built when your worth is no longer on lease from someone else's approval. Weeks later, that seed became something tangible. Clara and I partnered to create Proofroom, a quiet but powerful space for editorial storytelling beyond commercial trend cycles. It wasn't splashy. It wasn't meant to be. But the people who found it felt seen. That was the point. Not to be louder than the people who shut us out. Just clearer. Braver. Freer. And I realized something else too. Legacy isn't what you leave behind when you're gone. It's what remains when you walk out and they can't delete what you stood for. My story wasn't about revenge. It was about authorship. And the most dangerous thing you can ever take back from a room that tried to erase you is your voice. The gala came exactly 1 year after the night I sat in that quiet print shop sharing my story without a script. This time I wasn't invited as someone's guest or as a name tucked in small print. I was attending because Proofroom had just been selected for a Quiet Industry Award, one that didn't come with champagne showers or fake applause, but with recognition from peers who saw integrity as the loudest voice in the room. The ceremony was at the same hotel where the first gala had been held. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I didn't feel the need to dress it up. This time I arrived quietly on my own time, with my husband walking beside me, not ahead of me, not behind, just beside. The same cousins were there, the same colleagues who once joked that I lived in the margins, and yes, even my aunt wearing that familiar polished smile like it was part of her skincare routine. I didn't go to make a point, but points got made anyway. When the speaker read out the words, "For editorial courage, creative independence, and industry impact," there was a small shift in the room. Not dramatic, but undeniable. Some heads turned. Some eyes blinked just a second too long. And in that moment, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt still. Not the stillness of nothingness, but of completion. Like the breath you take before a new paragraph. Afterward, someone from the old circle tried to make small talk awkwardly, stringing compliments into what felt like an apology without using the word sorry. I let them, because I wasn't there for closure. I was already living past it. They hadn't changed, but I had. I no longer needed their version of success to validate my own. The most surprising part wasn't that they noticed me now. It was that I no longer needed them to. Later that evening, I stood near the back balcony overlooking the skyline. The same city that once felt like a maze now looked like a map I'd drawn by hand. My husband brought me a glass of water, not champagne, and said, "You know they still don't fully understand what you built." I smiled not out of bitterness, but because he was right, and they didn't need to understand it. They only needed to know they could no longer rewrite me out of the story. In the months that followed, Proofroom became more than a platform. It became a quiet movement. We didn't go viral. We went deeper, one story at a time, one voice at a time. And every time someone sent a note, saying I thought I was the only one we knew we were doing the right work, it wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, but it was real. As for my family, some tried to circle back. A cousin sent flowers. An uncle sent an awkward article mention, as if to say, "See, we always believed in you." I didn't respond, not out of spite, but because I didn't owe them access to the version of me they refused to stand beside when it mattered most. Forgiveness doesn't always mean return. Sometimes it just means you've made peace, without needing their permission. And maybe that's the point. Revenge doesn't always arrive as a dramatic scene. Sometimes it's a quiet room you built yourself, where their names are no longer spoken, not out of anger, but irrelevance. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to carry the weight of proving anything to people who made your silence a condition for love. My story didn't end with applause, it ended with peace. And if there's anything I've learned, it's that the real win isn't reclaiming your seat at their table. It's building your own, inviting only those who never asked you to shrink, and knowing that if they ever try to call you just a waitress again, they'll be saying it from the lobby while you're rewriting the menu. So let me ask you something, especially if you've ever been underestimated, erased, or quietly dismissed by the people who were supposed to know your worth first. What if your quietest season is actually the beginning of your real legacy and you've just been too loyal to the wrong room to notice?